Okay, so hello and welcome to week 3 of BPM 232, Buddhist Psychology. So last week we spent some time talking about the historical Buddha, a little bit of a biographical tour of how it was that he came to his state of awakening, enlightenment, what the sort of process was in terms of his background, how he eventually reached it, and then a bit about his life and his teachings. And then we began to cover off some of the basics in terms of, what the aspects of his teachings were. So we talked briefly about the questions of emptiness, right? The questions of non-self, right? And the question of suffering, generally speaking, at the overcoming of suffering, and the question of impermanence, right? So we talked about these things very briefly. Today's lectures are going to be the first of 4 weeks in which we're going to try to drill in a little bit more deeply on the Four Noble Truths. So as we describe those Four Noble Truths, they were arranged in some of his early teachings, right, as a kind of medical diagnosis, right? 4 steps. There is a problem. What's the problem? The problem is solvable, and here's the solution. Essentially speaking, those are the Four Noble Truths, or as I mentioned, as some people say, the Four Noble Provocations, or the Four Ennobling Provocations, as John Vervaeke sometimes refers to them. As I mentioned previously, I like that particular formulation of ennobling provocations because a provocation is something that moves you to response, it moves you to action. And one of the most important things, as I've mentioned, that we need to sort of remember about Buddhism is that it is not primarily speaking about a system of beliefs, okay? It's not primarily about a system of beliefs. It is in its essence a system of practice, right? So there is a substantial difference between having a belief about something and having a practice which conveys a direct experiential phenomenological awareness of that thing, right? And a set of sort of statements or a set of instructions about how to do something are not the same thing as the ability, as the skill in question. So the example I often like to use here is riding a bicycle, right? Before you could ride a bicycle, riding a bicycle was probably arcane, and people can tell you what to do, right? Sit upright and don't fall over and keep pedaling and so on and so forth. But until you've engaged in the practice of riding a bicycle, until you've sort of learned it on a somatic body level, what to do, right? Nothing you say can really convey this. And this is very obvious when, parents are teaching their kids how to ride a bicycle because, they push them out on the bicycle, on open pavement. And when they let go, they issue a series of statements that are fundamentally useless, right? Don't fall over, keep going, right? These are things that they're saying, but like, what does that mean, right? In terms of actually doing it. This is something that one has to sort of discover through practice. One has to discover it experientially. But once one does, it's then integrated to them. Then they're simply making decisions about where they go. Similarly, okay, as I mentioned, the system of Buddhism is a system of practices, primarily speaking. And it is in that sense intrinsically exploratory, intrinsically experimental. It is, in a great number of ways, right, a system for the skeptical, right? Don't take it on faith. Don't take it just because the Buddha says it. He's very clear about this. Instead, rather, do these practices and see, right? See what you experience. So the Four Noble Truths, which we briefly outlined, like I said, are going to be the basis of the next 4 weeks. And so we're going to start with the first Noble Truth here, which is everything is suffering, or life is suffering. Now, as I mentioned previously, the word that is customarily used here is dukkha, right? Dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, dukkha, right? That's a Pali word. And in fact, the translation that we customarily receive in English is suffering. And as I pointed out, that is not quite accurate, okay? It suffers from a very similar problem, honestly, to most sort of fine-tuned terms and languages. It's very hard to translate the specificity of something between a language briefly. So many of you, of course, speak more than one language. You'll be intimately familiar with this problem of trying to take a term and get it into another language. I can give you 2 very brief examples of this, right? So 2 terms that I really love in French that really have no direct analog in English, right? The first is déjà vu. So if I say déjà vu, most of you will know what I mean, that experience that one has of uncanny familiarity, right? You encounter something and you think, I've encountered this before, right? This is not the first time I've experienced this. And maybe you'll be asking yourself, did I experience this in a dream, right? Or did I have some kind of precognitive flash? But it's this feeling that you have on encountering something. This has happened before, right? The reason English imported the term déjà vu from French is that we don't have a term for that, right? I have to give like 3 or 4 sentences in order to sort of explain, you know, that thing where, right? So we just use déjà vu. It doesn't translate especially well. There's no easy term that we can append to it. We have to do a bunch of explanation. There's another sort of term, it's not a word, but it's a term in French that I like a great deal, which is l'esprit d'escalier, the spirit of the stairs. And see, if you just directly translate that, the spirit of the stairs, it means very little. But the spirit of the stairs is you've been having an argument or a debate with somebody, right? And then it finishes up and you leave and you start to descend the stairs because it's a Parisian expression, and in Paris most people are living in buildings, right? They're going downstairs, and so as you're going down the stairs, you suddenly think of the thing you should have said, right? Now most people have had this experience. You're having an argument or you're having a debate, and in the aftermath of it, you're like, oh, I should have said this, right? You come up with the perfect retort or the perfect sort of answer in some sense, and it comes after the fact. L'esprit d'escalier, right? The idea that this is very tightly expressed in French possesses no really good cognate term in English, right? We're just sort of forced to borrow it. And English, of course, is quite happy to borrow language from all over the place, right? It's sort of bring any piece of language it can find into itself if it doesn't have. So I bring these two things up just as examples of things not making the jump from one language to another language especially well. And if you've ever tried to do any translation work, you'll run afoul of this. Dukkha is a good example of this. You mostly hear the Pali word translated as suffering, but it's pretty clear that that's not quite right. Sometimes you will hear it translated as anguish, which maybe is a little bit closer, right? Suffering for us, as I mentioned, tends to connote physical pain, right? Suffering. It feels very physical to suffer in that sense. Anguish, on the other hand, has more of an emotional connotation to it, right? To be in a state of anguish is not primarily speaking about a physical pain, but somehow it's an emotional reaction, right? Anguish. But a yet better word that gets used is unsatisfactoriness. It's kind of a mouthful. Unsatisfactoriness. Now, when we think about dukkha, when we think about the concept of dukkha in these terms, right, that puts a distinct spin on the notion of suffering, unsatisfactoriness. And I mentioned in the last lecture that, you know, this is the sort of lurking possibility in some sense, right, that something can emerge, that it can be unpleasant for us at any time, right? But also, not just sort of like when things are going okay, right, it can get at us at any time, which is true, but also that even when we are experiencing pleasure of some kind, right, we're experiencing positive events in our life, that, you know, beneath them is this like, this will not last. This isn't going to last. And it makes it very hard for us to enjoy things, right? But there is this underlying anxiety that comes from the attachment to the moment. Okay, so that's a bit of a recap. Now, Buddhism, properly speaking, okay, actually delineates several different forms of suffering. And you'll see as we go through the course, or if you've done readings around this area, you'll be familiar that Buddhism is very fond of numbered lists. This appears to be one of the kind of main ways that they tried to structure things to make them easy to remember in the teaching, is that there are numbered lists. So you get the 3 this and the 4 that and the 8 this and the 12 that and the 51 this and so on and so forth, right? There are a lot of numbered lists, which generally, you know, there are better mnemonic techniques out there, but they give you a little bit of structure. So in this case, you know, Buddhism sort of discusses 3 forms of suffering. So the first is, roughly speaking, the suffering of suffering, okay? Loosely speaking, this is what we would think of as pain. This is closest to sort of what we think of often in the West when we think of the word suffering, pain, right? So this is like the basic pain that you're going to experience in life, and we will all experience pain, even if you are sort of relatively kind of healthy and hale and in good shape and whatever. Now, pain is going to happen, right? You're going to experience physical pain at some point. You're going to experience sickness. You're going to experience this kind of sort of basic unpleasantness. This is the suffering of suffering, okay? The second form of suffering that gets often discussed is the suffering of loss, okay? And this is, you know, as we've discussed, sort of a function of attachment. The people that we love and the things that we love and the places that we love, right? And the experiences that we love, when we lose those things, when they go away, right? When people die or places are no longer there or whatever, we experience a terrible pang, right? It's very difficult for us. It's sad and difficult. There's grief. So this suffering of loss is the second form, right? When things that we love go away, we experience the suffering of loss. That's sort of the second form. But the third form, the form that Buddhism in some sense is sort of primarily concerned with, is called all-pervasive suffering. All-pervasive suffering, okay? And this is the form of suffering that is the elaboration, okay, upon our suffering. We experience something unpleasant, but then our mind is elaborating on it, or we haven't even experienced something unpleasant yet, and our mind is elaborating on it, okay? That elaboration, which we'll detail more later, is called propensia, okay? But just think of it as it's sort of like that mental field, that elaborate, all pervasive suffering. And the point that Buddhism makes, insofar as Buddhism is concerned with suffering and bringing an end to suffering, okay, is that this is a self-inflicted kind of suffering, right? It's brought about by a delusion, in a sense, right? That we are perceiving the nature of reality in a deluded way, and therefore, you know, our experiences around it have this all-pervasive suffering. So this form, this all-pervasive suffering, this is the aspect of suffering that Buddhism is primarily concerned with, because it is the aspect of mental elaboration, right? It's the aspect of this self-inflicted kind of deluded form. Now, it's important to remember that in this sense, and I suppose in all these senses, right? Suffering is perceived within Buddhism as being sort of universal and largely impersonal, right? Universal and largely impersonal, which is to say everybody suffers, right? One of the basic things that you'll get in Buddhism essentially is that life is hard. Life is difficult. There is no way to go through life without experiencing some amount of suffering, right? So life is hard, life is difficult. But even though that is the case, right, it is very often that when we are experiencing like an undue amount of suffering, what we feel is an undue amount of suffering, we ask questions like, you know, why is this happening to me? Right? It seems very fair, or very unfair, rather. Life feels very unfair. Why is this happening to me? Like, why is this happening to me? What did I do? Why is this happening to me? This tends to be a kind of default response that we have when things are really piling up on us. And one of the things that we're sort of called upon to remind ourselves in Buddhism is this universal and impersonal aspect, that much of the suffering that you're experiencing is just baked in to the nature of reality. It is part of what it is to be a human being, to experience many of these forms of suffering. Now, you know, if you consider it in those terms, right, if the next time you're experiencing that, instead of saying like, why me? Why is this happening? This doesn't seem unfair. You instead go to the position of being like, right, all people are suffering, right? This is part and parcel of fostering the kind of compassion that is very much at the center of Buddhist practice. And of course, also the self-compassion, right? To have self-compassion in your role in such things. As we've discussed a little bit around the self-care and self-compassion assignment of the course, right? It's really central that you be able to direct compassion towards yourself and compassion towards others. Now, we tend in day-to-day terms to be selective in our application of compassion. So there are a couple of instances of this that come to mind pretty rapidly, and there are, of course, many cases, right, that people will, discriminate against certain groups and not feel compassion towards them, et cetera, et cetera. But a couple of groups that I've sort of given a lot of thought to as interesting groups that do not attract a lot of compassion are the wealthy and beautiful people, beautiful women, right? Physically beautiful people. Now, I have sort of had both these cases. I've worked with a number of wealthy clients, and I've worked with a number of people who, by most assessments or metrics, are quite beautiful. And it should be obvious to us, of course, that these people have problems, right? You only need to look at, the lifestyles of the rich and famous to see that many people are suffering with addiction problems, mental health problems, and so on and so forth. And indeed, that there are unique problems that come with their circumstances, right? Being wealthy brings its own problems with it, right? It can distort issues within a family. Money can be really difficult and corrosive within family ties. It can mess up people's sense of self-development, right? There's something to be said for sort of needing to develop yourself professionally because you got to pay your bills, and so you might as well develop yourself professionally, right? That often gets interfered with. There are unique problems that come with it. Now, that isn't to say, right, that having a certain amount of money is not obviously like useful and beneficial for the reduction of anxiety. But the idea that having sort of unlimited wealth is suddenly going to make your problems go away is one of these delusions that we see occur over and over and over again in our culture. But if you really look at the data around this, it's pretty easy to see that this isn't so. So for instance, lottery winners, right, people who win large sums of money, typically experience an enormous burst of happiness right off the bat, right? But within a year or so, they've returned to baseline, if not worsened. There are many cases, if you sort of go digging around, of people who win the lottery and it messes their lives up, right? All of a sudden, sort of their relationships with everybody change because everybody wants something from them. And so often it causes them to become insular and hard, right? Like winning a lot of money is not necessarily a good thing. Becoming a huge lottery winner, I would not wish that on very many people because I think most people don't have the capacities to easily handle it, right? Relative to everybody else, right? So, the idea that if you could just suddenly get rich, that's going to solve the problem is fundamentally, in some sense, a delusion, right? We know from the data, earning up to a certain amount of money does result in improvement in quality of life, right? It results in an improvement of, circumstances and a reduction of anxiety. But then past that point, it doesn't do that. And the number is not nearly as high as you would think. I think it's currently hovering at around $75,000 a year. Past $75,000 a year, money by and large does not buy happiness, right? And it buys unique sets of problems, right? But most people do not have sympathy for people in these circumstances. They don't really have a lot of compassion for the circumstance because, of course, they want it, right? There's like, yeah, well, if I got the money, I'd know what to do with it, right? But this, in fact, in case after case, turns out not to be so for the most part. Likewise, people who are deemed conventionally very attractive, it's the sort of thing where when those people talk about having problems around this, many people will not offer much compassion in that respect. But consider for a second what it is like to be very attractive. Consider for a second what it's like to be a very attractive woman. It causes a lot of problems. People want things from you that you are not always in a position to easily assess. People are attempting to deceive you quite often, right? They're attempting to deceive you quite often. This causes real problems for people in this circumstance. It is not uncommon for people who, by sort of luck of genetics, happen to be very physically attractive, to feel that that situation is kind of a curse in some ways, right? They operate under a kind of halo effect where people give them more regard maybe than they've actually earned, right? And so it's very difficult for them to judge their output because everybody responds more positively to them, right? So it's difficult for them in that sense. It's difficult for them to decide whether they are going to sort of lean in on this piece of good fortune or distance themselves from it. Like, this creates a set of problems. But note that for most of us, we don't experience a lot of compassion in that direction, right? What we experience is like a certain amount of envy and glorification. Oh boy, if only, without recognizing that it comes with its own set of problems. And never mind, of course, that both of these groups of people, right, who do not generally attract compassion from the public, also have to deal with all of the same existential issues that everybody has to deal with, that all of us have to deal with: pain, sickness, death, disappointment, loss, etc. Right? Even though they have, what might be perceived as an advantage in some sense, they're dealing with the same stuff because we're all dealing with it. So, I bring this up in part because, trying to find compassion for people, right, is sort of central to the practice. And one of the reasons that it's central is that it shows this impersonal and universal aspect to suffering. We're all, in some sense, going through the same thing. We're all experiencing the same thing. Recognizing that fact makes it, of course, easier to interact with people in many ways, right? Easier to, forgive in some cases, right? To not hold anger, to not hold a grudge, which can be kind of a corrosive emotion, right? Sits in a terrible way, a kind of poison, as the Buddha says. But also because, right, showing that universality and that impersonal nature is part and parcel also of coming to a clear-eyed recognition of our own situation relative to suffering. Now, as I mentioned, okay, this all-pervasive suffering that Buddhism is concerned with is largely a question of sort of delusion. It's self-inflicted, right? It's self-inflicted. And that's to say that it has, that there's an intimate link, essentially speaking, between what we perceive, but then how we interpret it. In the interpretation, the extra suffering is found, right? So in some cases, right, this is a matter of sort of anticipatory, right? Our pronounced ability as human beings to anticipate things. So you have a surgery scheduled in 2 weeks, right? And for the 2 weeks leading up to it, you're not really experiencing any pain. You're in perfectly good physical health. But if you're experiencing like anxiety about what's about to happen, right? That's a kind of elaboration that isn't keyed into the present circumstances of your moment. It's an anticipatory thing, right? It's a set of things that you're spinning up that are causing you to be afraid of what is to come, right? So that's one example of this kind of all-pervasive suffering that can afflict us. Something scary is coming up. It doesn't have to be surgery. It could be anything. It could be surgery. It could be an exam. It could be anything, a difficult conversation. And we're sort of spinning up to speed with all these elaborations, right? Which cause us anxiety, cause us suffering, cause us resistance, cause us dread, right? So there's that aspect. But then there is also an interpretive aspect. So I want to give sort of 3 examples of this just to get to this interpretive aspect, right? Because, as Shakespeare said, nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, right? This is, in some sense, a very Buddhist idea. Now, I'm going to attempt to demonstrate in the second chunk of lecture that that is not 100% true, right? There are sort of 2 different forms of truths in Buddhism, right? There are the truths that derive their, they derive their value, their truth, right, from the fact that we are agreeing on them or something. And then there are sort of basic truths, right, that are really part of the universe. It's an important distinction, okay? So when we say that nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, that's not entirely true, right? Some things are simply true. They're features of the universe. But most of the things that we're interacting with are not of this kind. Most of them are a set of basic presentations, basic sensory facts, but then our interpretation around them. And that interpretation can induce suffering. So let me give you a few examples. So the first couple that I want to give you are experiments, psychology experiments, famous ones. So the first one is a fairly famous experiment where what you do is you have the sort of experimental subject, right, the volunteer, and then you have a group of confederates, which is to say you have a group of actors, okay? And in the first sort of test condition, the first group of people, subjects, you give them a dose of norepinephrine, adrenaline, okay? So you're giving them a shot of adrenaline. Okay, so they're getting a shot of adrenaline. You all know what adrenaline feels like, right? Your pulse is rising, right? You feel very, very activated, very, right? Adrenaline. So they give them a shot of adrenaline. But then they are in the midst of a group of people, these Confederates, right, who are typically like grad students or something, who are actors, who do one of two things, depending on the experimental condition. Either the Confederates, okay, act really like worried and nervous and uncomfortable, right? They're supposed to have also gotten the shot, right? So the conceit is they've also received this shot of adrenaline. They act really like uncomfortable and frightened and anxious, and right? And what you will see is that in the group, right, that gets that shot and is among the actors who are acting like it's making them feel really terrible, they also will respond in this way. They'll feel the sensation of the adrenaline come up, right? And they'll interpret it, right, in the same way as the people around them, to be a fearful and unpleasant experience, right? My heart is pounding and I'm sweating and it's unpleasant. In the second group, okay, you also give this person a shot of adrenaline, okay? But the actors, the Confederates around them, instead act really excitable. They act happy. They're like, wow, this is great. Right? They, maybe, jump on the couch or something, and they're like, like, I feel amazing. And in that condition, the person will look around and see how everybody else is reacting to their shot, right? And then they'll respond in the same way with excitement, right? Wow, like I feel really excited and revved up. Now, in both of these conditions, the person is receiving the same shot of adrenaline, right? The physical sensations that they're experiencing are probably, if not identical, very, very similar, right? They're experiencing the same physiological thing. But the context of the experiment, right? How they're cued to interpret what they're experiencing determines their emotional reaction to it. You can look at that situation and be like, right, because they're in this fearful context, they interpret it fearfully, right? They experience a bunch of additional suffering. They experience a bunch of additional suffering that is not inherent to the sensations that they're experiencing due to the adrenaline, right? Because in the other condition, they experience it as pleasant and exciting. Now, you can think of all kinds of cases of this, right? People will differ pretty widely in terms of their sort of appreciation for adrenaline. If you like horror movies, or if you like roller coasters, or if you hate those things, probably it's because you're interpreting those circumstances very differently. Some people get on roller coasters and they love it. They love the rush, even though it's obviously sort of a fearful experience. A few years ago, I was at Canada's Wonderland at the edge of Toronto, and for the first time, I went on Leviathan, which is this absolutely enormous. I had never been on a roller coaster of this size. I like roller coasters, okay? I enjoy roller coasters a great deal. I enjoy those sensations. But, we were coming up towards the top of this first hill on Leviathan, and I suddenly experienced something I hadn't experienced since I was, 9 years old. I thought to myself, I don't like this. Like, I want to get off. They need to stop the ride so I can get off the ride. Like, this is not fun, right? I'm coming up and I'm watching, and we're going up the hill, and I can see sort of like all the nations of the earth spread out in front of me. Like, you can see really, really far. And it felt like too much. And then you go down the incline. It's very steep and it's kind of overwhelming. And then as soon as I got into it, it was actually a quite pleasant experience, right? We're going through it. But some people find that intensely unpleasant. Now, my assumption is here, right, like the adrenaline shot in the experiment, we're basically experiencing the same thing. But my interpretation of it is couched in safety, not worried about being hurt, right? Although in that moment, obviously, my faith was shaking a little bit, but I'm not worried about being hurt. And so I interpreted it as a positive form of activation. There are lots of experiences of this kind. There's I'm obviously now going to give you more than 2 experiments. There is a famous experiment, okay, where they showed that if you made somebody walk across a narrow, rickety bridge, okay, they would be much more likely to ask for somebody's number, right? Like to ask them on a date. So they would put somebody, at the far end of the bridge. And basically when they walked across, right, this narrow, rickety bridge, which was sort of adrenaline activating, right? They would still be highly activated when they got to the other side of the bridge, and that excitement would transfer to the other person on the other end of the bridge. So there's like, right, the same sensation gets cued in different directions, gets interpreted in different directions. okay? So you can see this adrenaline case, the context creates this elaboration. The elaboration creates the emotional sensation, anxiety, or excitement. Okay, let me give you another example. Another famous experiment. So what you do is you get a quality of, or a quantity rather, of butyric acid. Okay, this is a specific kind of chemical, and it has a really striking, sharp, quite strong odor. And then what you do is, before you waft it under the experimental subject's nose, you tell them one of two things. You either say, this is the smell of a fine cheese, or you tell them, this is the smell of vomit. Now, the thing is, the chemical in both conditions is exactly the same. The sense experience is exactly the same. And it may be the case that you don't like fine cheeses, right? Most people do not like the smell of vomit, but it may be the case that you don't like fine cheeses, in which case you will go, yeah, like fine cheeses do smell gross, right? For some people, that's true. But for many people, and certainly the people in this experiment, that cue, this is a fine cheese, as opposed to this is vomit, created a very different response. When you waft the butyric acid under the nose and you say, this is a fine cheese, what do? They go, and they smell it and they appreciate it. There is a connoisseurship to it. Right, like I can smell the cheese notes, right, they say. But you do the same thing to somebody, you say butyric acid, and you say, okay, this is a vomit. And they'll back off and gag, right? They'll experience a very strong gag reflex. Now, the sensory stimulus in both cases is the same. It's the same. The only difference is the context cue. It's how they come to interpret it. And so the person who, right, starts experiencing that, right, in a sense, has fallen prey to this kind of self-inflicted suffering. I mean, in this case, it's experimentally inflicted, but I think you get the idea. It's the interpretation of the event that causes them to experience this secondary and very unpleasant thing. And that's very unpleasant. We normally think of disgust reactions, right, as being, you know, like pretty biologically fundamental. And yet you can think about this case and be like, right? In some cases, fine cheese. So again, the interpretation of the act, right, can produce additional suffering. The interpretation of the act can produce additional suffering. Let me give you a third example, and it's an example that cuts pretty close to the bone for people. Body image. Many of us, probably most of us, okay, are deeply, we are not at ease with our bodies, okay? And I say this being somebody who is frankly not entirely at ease with his body, more at ease with my body, I add, than I used to be, but nevertheless, right? We're not at ease with our bodies. And a lot of this, of course, has to do with our context cueing, right? We see an endless number of, you know, airbrushed and filtered photos and, you know, stuff on Instagram and so on and so forth, right? We have this unreasonable international standard of comparison, and we have certain kinds of, right, beauty standards that pass through the culture that are often unrealistic, right? So, you know, I recall a few years ago, the sort of the rise of thigh gap as being a marker of beauty. And thigh gap is not a question of, you know, health or something. It's just a structural question of bones, right? And frankly, in many cases, like would not be particularly healthy for people to have. But people have, they wrestle with their body. They feel bad about it. But we can see immediately that so much of this is in fact cultural and contextual. In different cultures, there are different beauty standards. And in those cultures, right, things that might make people very uncomfortable in one culture or our culture, right, in fact, are going to be desirable in another culture. What that means is that the interpretation question of it, right, the context and interpretation of it is causing additional suffering for people who are uncomfortable with their body. And a large number of people are uncomfortable with their body, right? Men and women both have relatively widespread body dysmorphia, right, or eating disorders. And, you know, this is a complex field of questions, right? But nevertheless, you can see that in a sense, it has to do with an interpretive judgment. It's not just that they're looking at themselves and seeing themselves in some neutral light. They're looking at themselves and they're experiencing a set of elaborations and comparisons and distortions that cause suffering, right? That cause suffering. right? So this is a very kind of close to the bone example in a certain sense, because it is so widespread. Most of us will have experienced some measure of this, where we've been deeply uncomfortable with our body in some way. And yet that is it's an interpretive problem, right? In a certain sense. Okay, so I use these examples specifically because I want to sort of ground out again, right, this aspect of all pervasive suffering, that much of the time there is a distinction between what we're experiencing per se, the fact of what we're experiencing, and our set of resistances, elaborations, right, and various things around it, the way that we're emotionally around it, the way that our thoughts sort of orbit around it, right, and cause us significant additional pain, that we may in fact form beliefs based on this, and people they'll form various kinds of beliefs based on it that may not in fact, right, match up with the reality. You can see this, I mentioned this example of somebody being concerned about a surgery, 2 years down the road. And you can see in some cases, right, that people will have sort of such a strong suffering-based elaborative resistance to things, right, that they'll do things that are maybe not in their best interest. So it's relatively common, for instance, to talk to somebody who is experiencing some kind of health concern, right? They're having some kind of set of symptoms or illness, and they'll avoid the doctor, right? They'll avoid having the issue sort of diagnosed or checked out in some way because they don't want to know. Now, if you think about this for a second, it's a very strange approach to things. Like, if it is a serious issue, right, they are surely better off knowing sooner rather than later, but people will put it off because they don't want to know. That's a rare case, actually, where people will choose to embrace uncertainty, right, rather than choose an unpleasant projected circumstance, right? But they don't know. They literally don't know. They don't know if it's an issue or not. And surely it is the case that it is always better for them to know at some level, right? Obviously, we can think of edge cases where perhaps it is not better to know, but that would be relatively rare. For the most part, people are avoiding that information. They're avoiding getting more information because they're afraid of what they're going to hear, which is to say that they've projected ahead, right, but without the actual information. And so they'll avoid the actual information. Think about that for a second, okay? And think about the way that their elaboration, right, what they're sort of imagining might happen around this, in turn affects, right, their, what might be in their best interest. People do this all the time. Likewise, another example that we've talked about is the phenomenon where people will sort of avoid things so that they don't fail at them, right? Which is to say, like, if I don't play, I can't lose. This is so common. So many people engage in this in one way or another. And yet again, what is it that they're interacting with, right? When they're sort of having this, they're interacting with a kind of elaboration. They're interacting with a projective illusion rather than the circumstance itself. It's very often the case that when people are avoiding something in this way, when they actually go through the thing, it's not that bad. That's something you hear over and over again. Was it that bad? Well, no. You see this, psychologically speaking, okay, very often with phobias, okay, with phobias and anxieties, where people find the presence of something unbearable, right? And, the technique that you use in therapy to deal with this is exposure. How does this work? So somebody is, say, terrified of spiders. So what you do is you create this ladder, right? This sort of staircase of gradually increasing exposures to the thing that they're afraid of. And, at first you're like, do you think you can look at this picture of the spider for 30 seconds? And a large number of people just detest spiders. I like spiders, so I always find that a little odd. I think spiders are quite beautiful, but I understand people very widely are terrified of them and detest them. So you say, look, can you look at this picture of a spider? And they say, no. And you say, okay, how about this? Look at the picture of the spider for 15 seconds. And they say, no. And just try it. Just try looking at it for 15 seconds. So they look at it for 15 seconds. And, okay, how was that? They were like, it wasn't that bad. And then you ramp that up. Can you look at it for 30 seconds? Okay, just try it. right? And gradually, this occurring over days and days, this is not something you do in a sitting. Gradually what you do is you increase it. First, they're looking at pictures of spiders. Then maybe they're looking at a live spider, but behind glass in a tank, or they're watching video of a spider. Then maybe they're looking like close up. They're not standing 10 feet back from the glass tank, but they're sort of looking through at the spider in the tank. And I guess if you really wanted to escalate things, eventually you might get like a tame tarantula or something, right? Higher up the line. Now, if you have a fear of spiders right now, you're going, right? But the point is, at each step of this, there is a sense that they have the intolerability of the situation. I cannot take this. I cannot stand it. I cannot take it. But in fact, when you actually expose them to the stimulus, you can get this gradually increasing, right, tolerance to it. They're able to tolerate the distress of the situation, and it turns out not to be as bad as they imagine. And you gradually can work somebody out of a situation in that way. You just increase and increase and increase, and eventually they don't have the same kind of reaction, because much of their reaction is not about the thing in itself. It's about the elaboration. The suffering emerges in the elaboration, in their reactions, in their beliefs about what they can tolerate, in their sort of projected belief about what is going to happen, right? And if nothing bad happens and they do indeed tolerate it, you gradually train them in this direction. They learn to tolerate the distress. Now, bringing this back around, as we already discussed, right, one of the central components, in a sense, of this particular kind of Buddhist view around suffering is an idea of deep acceptance. And I made a quick kind of note about this, and this is something I will elaborate further in sort of the second part of this. But, Buddhism distinguishes, in a sense, two kinds of truths, right? One is the kind of truth that we think of as a sort of conventional truth. So like money, right? $100 bill is worth whatever it's worth because we have all agreed on it, right? The meaning of a word has the meaning it has because we agree to treat it in that way, right? Gold is worth more than silver because we say so. But if there were no human beings around, none of these things would intrinsically be true, right? A $100 bill would be, a piece of paper or plastic, right? It wouldn't have any particular intrinsic value. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not true in a certain sense, right? Because obviously, if you, take a $100 bill from somebody and they're like, hey, and you say, oh, it has no fundamental value, right? You're likely to get yourself in trouble. And likewise, you can take something and be like, this has no fundamental value. Like it is basically just a thing that we've agreed on in consensus reality. We made it up, but you can still use it to exchange for goods and services, right? So there is a provisional kind of agreed upon truth there, but there isn't an underlying truth. However, there is a second category of truths, okay, which is these underlying truths. And the notions of impermanence, right? The notion of non-self, okay, and the notion of emptiness, those three things, impermanence, non-self, and emptiness, these are, Buddhism claims, the Buddha claimed, features of reality, right? They're features of reality. To the extent that we are not seeing them, it is because we are deluded. That is the claim, that we get sort of obscured by our desires, right? By our cravings, et cetera, that we want things to be different than they are. And so we don't perceive these fundamental features, okay? But they are features of reality. They are sort of truths within reality. And as I mentioned previously, a big part of the question around suffering is an acceptance of suffering. It's an acceptance of suffering. Now, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean what many people take it to mean, which is it's not about giving up. People take acceptance to mean giving up, right? I accept it. And so it's just like you just roll over and take it. That is not what it means. Rather, it means it's seeing reality clearly so that you can deal with it, right? It's seeing reality clearly so that you can deal with it. So let me give an example. A number of years ago, I had a pretty significant falling out with a former friend of mine. And things had been rocky a few times in the past, and they really came to a head in a specific set of circumstances that kind of blew our friendship apart. That has not happened to me very much. I've often maintained my relationships, and I prefer to maintain my relationships on good terms, even if those relationships change. So I'm sort of friends with the majority of my exes, for instance, because I have always taken it as a given that if I liked that person well enough to date them, even if there isn't sort of a forward path in a romantic sense, even if we're not necessarily in a good position to be sort of life partners to each other or whatever, that nevertheless, like I liked them for a reason. And then it should be possible to sort of move things into a position where I can still like them, where I'm not terribly embittered by the situation, and right. And likewise, I recognize that friendships, like all relationships, can change. You grow closer to people and further from people, right? But at the same time, you can preserve something. And even if you're very different than a friend, even if you become quite different, that doesn't mean that there aren't grounds for friendship. I have some friends who are very different than me. I have a handful of friends that are, I would describe them as extremely conservative in a way that I am not conservative. Now, the way that I look at it is we have, those significant differences, but that doesn't fundamentally change the sort of open nature of the friendship or the relationship. We also enjoy each other's company in all sorts of ways. As a quick example of that, a friend of mine early on in the pandemic, a friend of mine, I was sort of dealing with quite a bit of stuff, and he brought up an issue specifically around kind of climate change. I think he said something like, well, I guess we're going to find out if climate change is real when everybody went in a lockdown. And I was dealing with a lot of emotional stress, both my own in early lockdown, but also, of course, my clients and my friends and my family, right? People were in a lot of distress. I didn't have a lot of spare capacity in that moment. But I briefly considered sort of texting back and being like, and then I thought about it and I was like, so I just said to him, dude, I've been dealing with people who don't think that there is, that COVID doesn't exist all week, and like trying to convince people, and et cetera. I've been dealing with people's distress. Can we please set this issue aside until we can have a proper shouting match with each other over a bottle of wine within hugging distance? This is what I wrote my friend. And that was the right answer. He laughed and he said, yeah, we can do that. This is the kind of relationship we have. We disagree about a great number of things, and that's okay. But this other friendship, when it kind of came apart, when it ruptured, it left me feeling very ambivalent. I don't like the idea of leaving a relationship behind in this way. I don't like the idea of closing a door. If at all possible, I like to sort of try to smooth things over. And so I was really wrestling with myself because I felt quite aggrieved. I was very upset at the way that I felt I had been treated in the circumstance. Like I felt that I had been treated quite poorly. But I kept wrestling with myself and being like, like I need to accept the situation, and I need to, I have to extend forgiveness, and it doesn't make sense for me to stay angry and all this stuff. And I was wrestling with it and wrestling with it, and I was having sort of bad feelings. And at a certain point, I realized that, an important part of what I was missing here, an important part of the acceptance in the circumstance, was an acceptance of the fact that I was angry, right? I was angry, and that my anger was okay. Anger is a human emotion. You can't just suppress every note of anger, right? But I was angry. I was angry at how I had been treated. But I was pushing that away repeatedly. I was not dealing with the situation as it actually was. I was sort of pretending or willing away or wishfully thinking, right, that I could not be angry and I could just restore the situation to the state that it had been in. I didn't want to deal with the emotion that I was experiencing because it was difficult. That's very often the case, right? People will have difficult emotions around things they do not want to acknowledge. They don't want to make space for because they're difficult. But a big part of acceptance, it's not about giving up. It's not about giving in. It's not about surrender. It's not about losing, right? In these ways, it's about seeing reality so that you can deal with it, right? And learning how to then process your feelings or the situation. Now, you can see in some ways how that obviously, right, begins to apply into questions about these sort of fundamental features of reality: impermanence, non-self, emptiness, right? But it also goes for our own experiences, our own human experiences. There are aspects of our experience that we're not going to sort of banish, right? We have certain kinds of reflexes and responses that we're highly unlikely to just get rid of, right? If somebody, jumps out of a closet with a scary mask on, I am almost certainly going to jump and shriek, right? That's going to happen. However, right, it's to some extent a different circumstance, okay? If you are sort of seeing through the circumstance in some important way. I had this happen to me once, actually. A friend woke me up from a very deep sleep. He was wearing like a crazy mask and singing a sea shanty, and I woke up and of course had no idea what was going on, and so I screamed, like I shrieked like somebody was murdering me, until my consciousness booted up to the point that I could just recognize that it was my friend, being an asshole, being a friend, right, sort of playing a prank, at which point I was like a little bit rah, 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 but then I was like, okay, that's actually kind of funny, right? The moment where I saw through to what I was actually dealing with, that it wasn't a threat, became the moment where I was no longer sort of right going over the top. Imagine if I had never had that recognition, but just continued to perceive him as being some sort of hideous clown monster. And you can imagine I would be in a state of abject terror. That altogether too often is the situation we find ourselves in. We get caught up in the elaboration and in sort of failing to penetrate through to the reality of the situation, right? We exist in a state of, right, terror. That's a big part of what we're getting at around the question of suffering. It's this question of asking yourself to what extent you're interpreting events in ways that are elaborating things as they come towards you, and can much of that be released? But also, it's about letting go of some of the fundamental illusions and the fundamental delusions that we hold, which cause us, right, to be so attached to certain things that are not so, right? That are not so. Now, this particular view of things, everything is suffering, has caused many people to think of Buddhism or Buddhisms as being fundamentally pessimistic, right? Everything is suffering, and the only answer is to obliterate your mind or to reach a state of blankness, and that's a misnomer. It's a mistake. It is not, in fact, right, what the system proposes, what the system of practices proposes. It's not a system of pessimism. It is a system of realism. And of course, a great number of people with pretty pessimistic outlooks will say, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist. But that is the actual move that one is trying to make here. This raises an important distinction, okay, when one is entering the work. And it's a distinction between optimism and hope. Those are two different things, optimism and hope. We use them interchangeably a lot of the time, but they're two different things, optimism and hope. Optimism is the unreasoning, everything's going to work out just fine. Everything's going to work out fine. Soon there won't be a problem. There will never be a problem. Hope, on the other hand, is a belief in your own capacity to engage. So there's a fairly famous set of stories around the prisoners of war that were taken during the American Vietnam War, right? Where prisoners of war, POWs, were taken to POW camps. And after they were released, they asked these people, like, who did well and who did poorly? And the response was immediate. They're like, oh yeah, the people who did really poorly, the prisoners of war who did really poorly, were the optimists. They were the ones who were like, yep, we're going to be out of here by Christmas. And then Christmas came and Christmas went, and they were still there. Yep, we're going to be out of here by Easter. And Easter came and Easter went, and they got crushed under the heel of this series of disappointments as they proceeded to make optimistic but unwarranted projections about, right, everything is going to be great. Everything is going to be great, and then had those things crushed. That's optimism. On the other hand, right, hope can operate from a standpoint of realism, not pessimism, realism. This is a bad situation, but I have resources to draw on. That is the standpoint that one, right, sort of must approach the question of suffering from. This is a bad situation, but I have resources to draw on. I'm not powerless in this situation. Right? I am not completely helpless in this situation, although I am powerless over certain aspects of it. It's universal, it's pervasive, it's impersonal, right? We can't escape from it in that sense. We still have resources to draw on, right? Resources in terms of our own powers of interpretation, resources in terms of our own penetrating intellect and insight, right? Resources which allow us to reframe the situation and to sort of corral our own mind so that we are not experiencing sort of this needless, all-pervasive suffering. Okay, so that's a brief tour of suffering. Well, brief because in the second part of this, I'm going to get into the second aspect of suffering, which is I'm going to touch on the real problems of the world. Because one of the other things that Buddhisms often get unfairly accused of is being sort of passive, right? Of looking the other way in the face of injustice and things. And I think that that likewise is very unfair. Buddhism is not a pessimistic system. It's not a nihilistic system. Rather, it's a system that purports that if you can grasp these features of reality, then much of your needless, right, suffering drops away. And that enables you to deal with the actual problems on the ground.